My name is Sam. I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager here at Fairygodboss. And Fairygodboss is the largest career community for women. Our mission is to improve the workplace by increasing transparency, and we offer a ton of great free resources like anonymous company reviews, job listings, articles, virtual recruiting events, and so much more to help you succeed throughout your careers. Before we get started, we will be taking questions at the end of today's webinar. So if you have any, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. And you can leave questions as yourself or anonymously, so feel free to ask whatever comes to mind. And as I said, we'll get to as many as possible at the end. We're also recording today's webinar, and we will be sending it out in a follow-up email later today, as well as Melissa's contact info. So if you have any questions about that, you want to rewatch the presentation, you will have the ability to do so. Here with me today is Melissa Boileau. Melissa is a senior HR manager and has been an HR professional for 7 years, getting her start in the field through a rotation while in retail management. She's passionate about employee and leadership development, creating healthy and inclusive team environments, and influencing leaders to drive performance through employee motivation. Thanks so much for being here today, Melissa. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thank you guys so much for joining. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with you guys, and hopefully, while nothing I'm sharing is earth-shattering, I hope that it helps each of you prepare for, perfection, or as close to perfection as you can get for your interviews. So thanks so much for spending the time. Like Sam said, I got my stint in retail management. I wanted to give you guys just a little bit of a bio about me so you knew who you were hearing this advice from. So I am originally from the Washington area and wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to all my friends and family there who are experiencing some extremely scary times right now with the weather that's going on in the fires. So please stay safe and ensure that you are taking care of yourselves and your families. I went to high school out in Washington and got my start into my professional career at Green River Community College. I'm the first in my family to go from high school into college, and so did a community college instead of straight to university. It was a really good introduction for me, balancing both school and work. So shout out to local community colleges and schools. I think that was a really great way for me to understand balancing multiple competing priorities in life, and really set me up for some success. I transferred to the University of Washington, where I studied business management. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life, and so business seemed like a pretty safe kind of career path for me. And while there, I found Target. So I completed an internship at Target in the stores, and decided to accept a full-time position with them. So I did a few rotations. One was in guest experience. I did a logistics rotation, and then a human resources rotation as well. Ultimately, I became a store team leader for Target and led over 160 team members in a $26 million store. It was a lot of responsibility for someone pretty young, but in that time, I learned so much. It was the first time that I had worked somewhere where it was a performance-based, company. And it was really scary for me accepting a position where I felt like, oh my gosh, I could be separated at any moment if I don't perform. But it taught me a lot about focusing on the right things. And I learned very quickly that in order to focus on the right things, I needed to focus on people. And leading a really large team, it was important to get everybody on the same page. And that became my passion. Leadership development really became my passion. And one of those components was helping people achieve the career success that they want, including, preparing themselves for interviews. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you today kind of comes from my experience at Target. I then transitioned. I moved to Arizona, where I am today. I heard there's someone from Santan Valley. I'm actually in Queen Creek, so you're my next door neighbor. So thanks for joining today. And when I made that transition, I also decided to change careers. So, retail management is kind of hard, and I thought that at some point I'd like to transition into something I could see myself doing for the rest of my life. And so I accepted a HR manager position for Dish Network, and I started off as a HR manager in our contact center, call center. I then transitioned into our in-home services division, where I support several different regions throughout the United States, and also our corporate team in our in-home services division. You see a picture of my family there. We like to have fun. So that is my husband, and I also have two beautiful little girls. So enough about me. Let's talk about why we're here today. So we're here to talk about the interview process, specifically interviewing, and the 5 Ps. So these are the 5 Ps I've come up with for success in interviewing, and then we'll go into some other kind of miscellaneous tips before we close out and talk about credits. So let's jump right into it. So in the interview process, there's the pre-candidate process and then the post-candidate process. So pre-candidate, a company is determining that they have a need on their team. They're understanding what that need looks like, what skills they need in a candidate. They're writing an appropriate job description, selecting a salary range, and then really looking at the market, both of those candidates who formally apply and then also candidates who they source, right? So proactively going into the market and finding people who fit the need that they have. We're really going to focus today on the post-candidate process. So that is, once they've found you, right, how do you prepare yourself to be successful through this process? So this would start with a recruiting screen in most cases. So an more informal conversation with someone from the recruiting team. It'll then go to an interview with a hiring manager. There's several different ways that organizations can interview. Typically it's with a hiring manager, but you may also see peer panel interviews. So you're getting to meet some of the peers that you might work with and ask them questions about the job that they do every day. You might also meet with direct reports if you're in a manager role. And then you may also meet with folks from the HR team. So through all of those different interviews, you're generally not the only person they're interviewing, right? So recruiters generally like to submit a slate to the hiring manager. So at my organization, that's at least 3 people. And then that hiring manager will determine who they'd like to move forward with. And put someone into the offer stage, which would include any negotiation that you have about the offer that you're going to accept, and then ultimately, hopefully, a successful offer. So we're going to jump right into the process talking about power stories. So why start with power stories? Power stories come out of a technique of interviewing, which is behavioral-based interviews. If you haven't heard of that before, there's a ton of research on the internet, but essentially, behavioral-based interviews started in the 70s, and the premise is that your behavior, your past behavior, is a better predictor of future success than just asking a candidate about, what would you do if, right? So thinking about that, I like to compare this to the lottery. If you won the lottery tomorrow, what would you do with the money? And you hear people come up with really great, really grandiose things. They'd travel the world, they'd give back, they'd give to charity. They would do these amazing things. What might be a better predictor of what you'd actually do if you won $1 million would be to ask someone, in the past when you've come into money, maybe a bonus from work, maybe an inheritance, what have you used that money for? And they may say like paying off bills, paying off my car, doing some home renovations, right? So that may be a better indicator of what you would do with an additional sum of money in the future than what if you did this great thing. So power stories are you coming up with things throughout your career that you've achieved, successes that you've had. Hopefully you're doing that already. Hopefully you're journaling. I've got a journal up there because, it's really helpful to do this throughout your career. And capture things that are successes that you've had, projects that you've worked on, positions you've held, and think about not only what the result was in the end, but your thought process, your approach, the techniques that you used in order to get to that result. And then it all becomes storytelling, right? So it's really, really important through power stories that you become a storyteller and you think about a clear story that you're going to tell. It's concise. You don't want to be talking for 15 minutes in an interview without getting to another question, but it should be compelling, right? It should be something that we want to listen to that gets your interviewer excited to hear about, and ultimately is climactic, right? It should be a win, a powerful kind of representation of the performance that you can bring to the table. And I would recommend that be data-driven. As much as you possibly can, if you're able to capture your performance through, ROI or a number in which you achieved from a sales perspective, right? Some sort of data-driven result. And if there are multiple positive results, I would try to find power stories that would share those. The other point that I would make regarding power stories is thinking through maybe 5 to 7 of these in your career that you're most proud of. They can range through a time that you failed and how you turned that into success, or a learning opportunity, maybe how you developed a teammate or someone that reported to you, how you were able to, drive success in a project, right? And think through your career history and start really journaling down these power stories to the things that you're most proud of, right? Things that you'd really want an interviewer to hear and know about you. And then find a way through the interview to tell your power stories. So if you get into an interview and it's not a behavioral-based format, right, you still have these power stories in your back pocket that are really, really well kind of written out, well thought out, and you want to find a way to tell these to your interviewer. And so there is a bit of, power in you being the interviewee and leading the interviewer, right? And making sure that you have an opportunity to share things that you're particularly proud of. A skilled politician doesn't only answer the question that's asked, right? But they find a way to tell you the talking points that they want to get across. And so while you need to demonstrate that you've listened to the question and you're answering in a manner that's appropriate, you don't have to follow to a T the question that was asked. So for example, if an interviewer asks, tell me about a success that you've driven and what that looked like in a short amount of time. The success would usually be something that maybe is more business focused and goes to more of like that numerical data-driven approach. If you don't have a power story that matches, you may talk about talent development and how, you were able to achieve success through someone else. So it may not fit exactly, and you'll ultimately be able to share a success, but you want to make sure that, again, you're highlighting the things that you're most proud of in your career that make you a successful potential employee for the organization. All right, we're going to move on from power stories and talk about preparation. So getting prepared for an interview is ultimately the most important thing that you can do before you step foot in the door. So you want to ensure that you do your research, right? This is all about understanding the company that you're going to be interviewing for, the current events, what's happening in that organization, what are they in the news for lately? If it's a smaller organization and it's harder to find information about them, can you network with people on LinkedIn and maybe see what they're posting, right? Understand where the organization is at this moment. If you can, network with folks that have worked there in the past or present, it's really helpful to understand even things like Glassdoor, what the feedback is about the organization. And even if it's not positive, right, understanding that context going into the interview will give you, questions that you can potentially ask. You also want to make sure that you really tailor your approach to the organization. And that may be, your level of professionalism and formality. I had a colleague of mine who's extremely professional. She comes everywhere dressed to the nines. She always looks great. She speaks with, very professional vernacular. And she was prepping her husband for an interview that he was doing. And she really, coached him on wearing a suit and, all of these things that he was going to do when going to this interview. And he got there and it was a really casual, laid back environment because it was an IT organization. And, he really felt out of place. And so while you always want to be like one step above, right, maybe, if they're going to be very casual in shorts and jeans, maybe you don't want to go to that extreme, but you'd be in khaki pants and, no tie. Versus a suit, right? So just really making sure you do your research. You also want to make sure that you're very genuine, right? Be who you are. So I would say, you know, this is the best version of yourself that you're going to be presenting in an interview, and be prepared for that. But also be genuine to who you are, right? You want to tailor your approach, but not so much so that you're not who you are every day. The last image I have up there is predict. So this may be a little bit hard, but again, based on your research, try to anticipate what questions this employer may ask of you. Make sure that you're preparing answers based on the position or the industry that you're in. And if you're looking to kind of get new experience and not do the same exact thing that you were doing previously, again, do your research, understand that organization and also that type of role. If you're going into a project management role, for instance, understand the vernacular associated with that type of position, particularly if you're coming in as someone who was maybe just an operations manager previously and doesn't have PMP experience. If you don't have the certificate, that's okay, but you can get a lot of the research online without taking a formal class. And from a preparation standpoint, the last thing that I would encourage you to do is formulate questions that you're going to ask the interviewer, and have a breadth of questions. So if things are answered throughout the interview, you're not asking something that they already answered, but you're asking something new. And even if that's a question around, you know, things that they've learned or what their favorite part of the organization is, make sure you ask a question. You want that interviewer to feel that you're very genuine, that you're inquisitive, right? That you really want to see yourself at that organization. Take every opportunity that you have to ask questions and ensure that there's a mutually beneficial fit, right? You want this job as much as they would like to hire you, but only if it's going to be a good fit for the long term. So understand that they're asking you a lot of questions to ensure that you're going to be a great employee for them, and you need to ask questions to ensure that it's going to be a place you actually want to work and come every day. All right, we're going to move on to the third P, which is practice. And I just love this image here. This is a Sarah Anderson cartoon sketch. But there's a misconception that, you know, if you're good at something, it's because it was a gift, right? We've all heard about, you know, professional athletes who practice and practice, right? Michael Jordan being one of the most famous, where he didn't just become the professional athlete that we all know him to be. He spent countless hours, and I think famously, like, didn't make his high school basketball team, right? So practice is really everything. Take your preparation that you've done, the power stories that you've learned, and practice. Practice everything, right? Practice storytelling. Practice delivering your power story, maybe in front of a mirror, maybe in front of a trusted feedback partner, but practice, right? Then you want to practice silly things. Practice your handshake. Practice making eye contact. Practice the drive to the interview, or, you know, in today's world, maybe that's practicing getting on a Zoom call, making sure the technology works for you. Sam was so gracious this morning to make sure that my technology worked, that my screen sharing worked, that my audio was okay. It's really important that you come prepared, and that only happens through practice. You know, practice your smile. If it's going to be a phone interview and there's no video, you can really hear if someone is smiling through the phone. You know, it's important to make sure that you've practiced these things so that when the moment comes, right, you are prepared. And then think about the nuance, right? If you're driving and it's 30, 45 minutes from your house, what does the road construction look like that day? What does traffic look like? You want to make sure you're early. So think about buffers, right? Buffers for technology if you're on a Zoom call, buffers for traffic if you're driving in. You know, I've had in a previous organization or position that I had, whenever candidates would come, they'd get very confused at the markings on the door and the parking lot and the way the building was situated. So we would get a ton of phone calls day of. It always stood out and impressed us when someone would call the day before and say, hey, I just, you know, drove in and I couldn't find the door. My interview is tomorrow and I want to make sure that I'm not late. That really stands out to someone, that you're excited about the position, you want to get this job. So understand how these things look to the organization that you're applying for. And again, practice your power stories, because no one is good at, you know, speaking in general, right? People who are professional speakers have gotten so from really practicing, from honing that craft and ability. And it may be uncomfortable to talk about ourselves in the context of an interview and the amazing things that you've done, but it is an interview and you have to sell yourself. So practice that ability to speak about your results, your performance and accomplishments, and get comfortable speaking about I instead of we, right? We're very trained in our workplaces to talk about the team that we're on and team success. But when you're in an interview, you're interviewing yourself, right? The team that you work with is not interviewing for a position. So ensure that you are selling what you will bring to the table. And again, in those power stories, it's so important to really tease out those details. You know, one thing I maybe didn't go into detail about in the power story itself is that you'll want to ensure, you know, there's a beginning, middle, and end. And when you open that power story, again, practicing talking about the context in a very brief way, talking about your thought process. So you may say, you know, there were 3 possible solutions to this problem that I had. I evaluated X, knew that it wasn't going to work because of Y, same thing for item 2, and ultimately landed on doing this. That lets me see your thought process, how you've evaluated information. Then how did you go about that, you know, that project work? What steps did you take? Again, what was your thought process? How did you prioritize? And then ultimately, what was the success that you had? And to do that really cohesively in a couple of minute story, it takes practice. You have to practice telling that story, maybe watching yourself on camera and seeing the funny things you do, the funny facial expressions that you have, and practice delivering it in a way that's concise and is really going to land well with the interviewer. Again, you can do that with a feedback partner if recording seems a little bit awkward, but it is important to practice. All right, the next P is presentation. So what does this mean? Presentation to me is all how you show up in an interview. And are you conveying what you want to convey? Again, it's really important to understand the organization that you're going to be walking into, whether that's, you know, a business casual, business formal type environment. I do personally recommend that you're always one level above maybe what the company culture would be. You don't want to come in underdressed, right? But presentation isn't only about dress. This is how you represent yourself. So think about everything from the moment you arrive until the moment you leave. And in a previous position, we would always ask our front desk coordinator that day, like who stood out to her and who, you know, maybe didn't show up well. And we'd get really interesting stories of kind of disrespectful interactions with her. You know, maybe people who are on their phone didn't seem very engaged in the process. If she was asking what questions do you have, they didn't take that opportunity to interact with her. So just thinking about that, right? From the moment you walk in, you're on stage, and anything that occurs throughout this interview process, right? Whether it's a casual conversation with a screener up front, maybe it's through the negotiation process and how you handle yourself going through negotiating benefits, negotiating salary, right? Think about every interaction, how you phrase things, and how you represent who you want to be to that organization. Put your best foot forward and be the best self that you can be. Again, this should still be you. It should still be genuine to who you are, right? So I wouldn't say do anything outside of something you're comfortable with. If it's an organization that doesn't align with your values and you feel that you'd have to be ingenuine to get the job, you don't want that job, right? Because you don't want to show up every day and not be who you are. So think about finding an organization that is aligned with your values, whatever they may be, and really making sure that once you understand what those are, you come with that version of yourself that's the best you. And so you may have a unique hairstyle, right? Rainbow hair, right? That's okay. That's you. But I would still encourage you to be, neat, clean, and not obscene. So come that day groomed appropriately, again, genuine to who you are, but just thinking about you didn't come in with a totally wrinkled shirt, you've ironed your shirt or at least fluffed it in the dryer, right? So I stole this from State Farm, my girlfriend who works there. This is their dress code: neat, clean, and not obscene. And the last of the P's is presentation, or I'm sorry, I think I have two more, is presentation. Oh, sorry, second slide, still a couple more talking points, apologies there. The last couple of points that I want to say is verbal and nonverbal cues. So a lot of times we think about verbally what we say, but again, under that practice and having a feedback partner, think about the nonverbal cues that you'll be representing. So eye contact. Again, Zoom is now our new norm and we're getting a lot better at it, but are you looking at the person in the eye, so into the camera, or are you looking at a second screen maybe where you have information, right? It's a very different representation of you if you're focused on the person at hand or if you're looking to the side. So think about how you come across. If it's in person, again, eye contact is still very, very important, as is a firm handshake, confident body language, right? You want your shoulders back, your head up, your chin up. This is all about the confidence that you have, that you can do this job that you're applying for. And I know from a female perspective, we often have imposter syndrome. And if maybe a tough question is asked or something that you don't feel very comfortable with, you may reflect that in your body language and start to have some self-doubt. You may see yourself kind of slouch down. So really be attentive to thinking through your confidence and that you have earned the ability to be there. You wouldn't be in this interview if you didn't have everything it took to get up to this point. So be confident in yourself and what you bring to the table. If you get a question that you're not prepared for, have a strategy for rebounding. If that is, give me just a second, let me think back to it. Can we circle back to this question in a few minutes and be thinking in the back of your head? Or again, if you have that skilled politician perspective where you're able to shift and think about another way to tell that story or another angle to answer that question, really think about that pivot and practice that pivot. Maybe practice getting some interview questions that are a little bit uncomfortable and how do you respond to those? You can Google interview questions all day long, behavioral-based interview questions, and you'll get a plethora of questions that you could prepare yourself for. I recommend really focusing on your power stories instead of developing, a million answers to questions that can come up in an interview. But it is also helpful to understand what are some of those questions that I may not have a power story for, and how can I either shift one of my power stories to answer that question, or, what are some tactics of thinking on my feet that I can use for some of these one-off questions. All right, and now the last P is positivity. So, I'm not an expert in all company cultures. There may be some company cultures where, positivity is not thought highly of, but from my perspective, it's always better to frame what you say in thinking about the glass half full than empty. The most typical way that I see this coming through is previous employers. And when someone's walking me through their resume and talking about the transitions that they've made in their career, mentioning things that are pretty negative about a previous employer, while they may be true, I think it's always beneficial to talk instead about the things that you enjoyed at the organization and maybe why you wanted to go to a new company. And so you may hint at something that you weren't a huge fan of. Let's say a workplace that was extremely competitive. You might have been miserable there. It maybe was a toxic culture. But instead of saying it was a really toxic culture and I hated that everybody was cutthroat and it was really competitive, you say something like, I looked for an organization where I could really be a part of a team and thrive in a culture where we excelled through the strengths everyone brought to the team. Maybe that would point or hint at the fact that the last company wasn't focused on a team culture, but it wouldn't come across in a manner that seems very negative. So think about how you frame things, right? It's really important to think about it from the lens of, would I want this person on my team? Would I want to work with this person every day? And if they're the constant naysayer that's looking at everything as impossible, oh, that's a no. My initial reaction is, that's too hard, we can't do it. That's probably not someone that I want to work with every day. So unless you're in an industry where maybe you're forecasting risk, right, you want to think about how you frame things with positivity, with gratitude, and probably with a little bit of fun, right? So think about the potential answers that you may have to a question. Again, practice your tone, practice, how you frame things in a way that come across with gratitude and learning. And, if you've had failure, we've all had failure, right? I think it's important to talk about what you've learned and how you've rebounded versus really focusing on the negative aspects of that failure. I personally think failure is key to us being successful. So if you frame this failure that I had, this huge setback that I had, shaped the way that I thought and ensured that I constantly went through an analysis process where I did X, Y, and Z, that's a very positive outcome. It may have had a negative impact at the time, but instead focusing about what you've learned, I think will come through much better in an interview. And then again, tone, right? It's very important. Try to fluctuate your voice so that you're not at a monotone and that you're hard to listen to. Think about your energy level and what you bring to that interview. If you're passionate, if you're excited, you'll want to make sure that you smile through the phone and think about those positive things. So that was a lot of information that I went through pretty quickly, and it's a lot of work, right? So getting ready for an interview honestly starts a long time ago, right? If you want the position that is available or opens tomorrow, you've got to prepare yourself today, prepare yourself a year ago. It's all about being ready and spending the time, effort, and energy that it takes to get ready for that position in advance. A couple other miscellaneous tips that I have, this is a personal pet peeve of mine, but is spelling people's name incorrectly or saying people's name incorrectly after they've told you how to say their name. I have a colleague that I'm working closely with, and her name is Sonia, and everyone calls her Sonia. She even has on our company profile like Sonia of how to say her name. And I think it goes a long way with her when you say her name correctly. And she's presenting for an event that we're doing at my workplace tomorrow. And one of the questions I asked her was, how do you say your name? And she's like, I'm so grateful you said that because it's a pet peeve of mine. So don't underestimate if you're the interviewer or the hiring manager, would you pass someone by because they spelled your name incorrectly or they didn't say your name correctly afterwards? I've also had, through our interview process, we have multiple interviews. So you may interview with 3 or 4 people. If you don't remember anyone you've interviewed with or their name up until the point that you got to me, that's a huge turnoff, right? Oh, I think his name was Bill, maybe? I'm not sure. I didn't write it down. It just seems like you don't care. It seems like you didn't take the time to write the name down from the invite you got, or that you had a really valuable conversation with that individual. So spell correctly and remember people's names. I think that's very important. My other tip here would be listen, right? It's hard. I know for me, I'm a talker, so it's hard to always stop and listen. But important to understand what is being asked of you, right? What questions, if there's really, again, you want to try to pivot when you don't have an answer available. But if it's a really specific question, or if there's multiple instructions within a question, you want to try to follow directions. So it's also, this is a little bit of a fine line here, is how do you listen closely and pivot your answers? There is a little bit of an art to that. So again, it's important to practice, but I try to not trick people, but when I interview folks, I will ask multi-part questions. Maybe tell me about a time when something happened, then how did you respond? What did the follow-up look like? And what did the team members that you worked with on the project think? Right? And if you kind of answer one piece and forget 3 pieces, and I do that 3 times to you, I'm going to walk away thinking that you can't follow directions or, maybe aren't listening appropriately. So just think about how that comes through, right? Listen closely. Read emails closely. If there's instructions on this is a video interview, make sure that you don't get on only audio. So, just make sure you try to take the process very seriously. Again, an interviewer is always going to be viewing this from how engaged are they in the process? Are they showing that they care and really giving the adequate time to the process? The last piece I would have here is sending a follow-up email. So back before email, right, people would send a card or a letter to an interviewer thanking them for their time. You know, now I don't get so many letters or cards, and I really don't expect them because of the speed at which we move. But it is very nice to get a thoughtful email after an interview that says, appreciate the time that you took. You know, maybe there's a takeaway, something that they learned. Something, you know, that they took away from the interview we had, you know, a learning or something that they didn't get throughout the process that they got from me. If I feel like it was very tailored and, you know, really stood out, it's something I always make sure to communicate to the hiring manager. Wow, this really impressed me. This person really took time outside of, you know, the average candidate that I've had for this position. And actually, I have one more thing. I said last one, but don't hold me to that. The last thing I would have is explain your thought process. So if there's something that occurs throughout the interview process, you have to cancel one of the interviews. You're negotiating a later start date, right? Or you're negotiating a higher salary. Again, remember that you're on stage, and really this whole process until you start at an organization day one, you're really interviewing. So if there's something that comes up, there's some sort of snafu, explain your thought process. It's okay to ask for any of these things, but if the recruiter doesn't understand the why behind it, and the hiring manager or senior leadership asks, oh, they must not really want it, they had to push back their start date twice, but you then explain, you know, I have a student who's doing virtual learning. Their schedule's been changed multiple times. The school district just pushed back in-person start date, XYZ, whatever the answer is, right? If that recruiter understands it's a legitimate thing that they can speak to, the company will understand, right? They ultimately want to hire you. That is their goal. It's not a gotcha moment. They do want to hire you. But it's important that they understand what's going on so they don't see it as disengagement with the company, or they're just looking for a better opportunity in the meantime. I have the rainbow on here because to me this is a lot of work, but there is kind of a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow, and that is all of your hard work paying off for a position that you really want to get and you're excited about. So it's worth all of the stress and the hard work up front to get that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So the last thing I have here, I had to do a plug for allyship, and that is throughout my career, I've had amazing mentors who have helped me grow and develop. I think it's so key to have, you know, have those mentors, have those feedback partners who can help you work through being really great. And I could say one of the things that Target did such a great job was preparing me for being a successful interviewer. I had to interview for pay grade raises. I had to interview for every position I ever had with them. And that really helped me prepare. But I had a key mentor. His name was Tim Snow. He actually just retired from Target a couple of weeks ago after more than 30 years with the organization. And he was someone who championed me, who helped me grow. And I've worked so hard to pay that back to other people that I work with, because it really allowed me to be the leader and the person that I am today. So I would encourage you not only to find a great mentor, but to also be a great mentor for somebody else. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa. What a great presentation. I saw a lot of great comments in the chat. Just a reminder, we're taking questions now. You can leave them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to leave questions as yourself or anonymously, but we already had a ton come in, so let's get started. We had an anonymous attendee say, I have an initial phone screen today. What are some fundamental or key questions that I should ask the company and the recruiter besides, you know, just asking about company culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me in particular, right, I have a belief that every interview should be about mutual fit, right? So you should really be understanding if this is a place that you want to work, if you're excited to work there every day, and they're going to be doing the same thing about you. So do you have some key things that you want to ask because they would make you either want the job or not want the job, right? Do you fully understand what the responsibilities are? I know as an HR professional, I'm really guilty of making job descriptions that are like everything you could possibly do and the kitchen sink. And it may be really hard to read that job description and understand like, what do I actually do when I get there on day one? And what will my like day-to-day be like? So if there's questions that you have about the role, I would ask them. If there's questions maybe that you have because of right now from a timing, right, with COVID and the pandemic and virtual work and being physically somewhere, if that's something that's really important to you, I would ask maybe about that. Again, think about how you frame the question because you don't want your employer to think that you never want to show up and meet anyone. But if there's something going on that you want to make sure the company will provide or have for you, I would certainly ask those questions as well. Again, just practice with a feedback partner about how that would come off and make sure it shows up the way that you want it to show up. But I would honestly just look inside yourself and think, what are the important things to me that I want to know before I'm excited to continue putting forth effort in this process.
Perfect. Another anonymous attendee, this is a really interesting question. They have unusually high energy is how they describe themselves. And they said that that often makes people uncomfortable. They said they can act more, normal, but it's an energy suck and they feel very stiff and uncomfortable themselves. Do you have any advice for them when they're in these situations?
Yeah, well, I'm a little guilty of that myself. So I would say, in general, a technique that I always do is avoid caffeine before, a presentation or something like an interview, right? Because I'll get like sweaty palms, be really nervous, elevated heart rate. So I would ensure that you get a good night's sleep, don't have a bunch of caffeine before your interview. And then as far as, your personality goes, this kind of goes to the genuine piece. You want an organization where when you show up every day, they're going to say, like, I'm excited about this person and the energy they bring to the table, and not, gosh, that person's so annoying, they're too much to deal with. So think about finding a company where it is an exciting culture that your energy is going to be welcomed. And then, this is a little bit tough, but I would say you don't want it to be something where you're constantly in a state of trying to control yourself, but maybe just what are techniques that you can use personally to calm down. I read an emotional intelligence book recently, and one of the things that resonated with me was breathing and some breathing techniques that you can use to calm yourself, because, there's some link scientifically to, deep breathing techniques, breathing through your whole diaphragm and, holding it for a count of 6 or 8, and then, releasing through your mouth, that actually help kind of reset some things in your brain. So maybe there's some techniques that you can use that will allow you to just like take, you could disguise it with a sip of water or something, but, allow you to kind of reset and not get too amped up in any moment.
Yeah, that's great advice. Breathing exercises are a great way to do that. Just getting yourself into a really healthy, mental state where you're feeling very calm will definitely set you up for success. Another anonymous attendee asks, for virtual interviews, how do you recommend asking about what to wear during the interview? Should I ask the hiring manager directly, or should I just do some online research? I don't know anybody at the company, so not sure what to do.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's probably so many people in that boat for smaller companies. Larger companies, it's easy to go to Glassdoor and, they have an interview section that you can read, not only questions, but maybe cultural pieces. If you don't know anyone at the organization, it's hard to find information online. I would certainly ask the screener. I would maybe avoid asking the hiring manager unless you've built a really good relationship. But generally, it's the recruiter's job to help you be successful through the interview process. Remember that the recruiter is being measured for how long their positions are open and, the candidates that they're successfully bringing to the table. So their goal through this whole process is to help people get hired, right? So they should be your best friend through the interview process. And so you might have some, questions that you ask them, like, hey, I really want to be successful in this interview. what should I wear? What are things that maybe, you know, questions I didn't ask that other candidates ask that you normally give answers to, right? Anything you didn't tell me yet that normally you tell folks, right? Ask maybe open-ended questions so they're giving you a lot of information. And not only what you wear, but like, what should I be prepared for? Again, if it's a company who's really formal and you get there and they ask you for a copy of your resume and you don't have it, you're going to be caught off guard and really embarrassed, and it's going to start the interview on the wrong foot, right? So ask up front, should I bring references? Should I bring, you know, a copy of my resume? And if you do those things, I would print them on cardstock. I would print them very like professionally, right? Make sure your printer doesn't have like lines in the middle of it or something. If it's a company that's maybe really tech savvy, that might look silly if you have this antiquated old cardstock resume. So asking questions up front, like what's the culture? What should I expect? You know, when I get there, who will greet me? Just asking lots of open-ended questions I think is good. And just remembering that the interviewer wants you to be successful.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'd also like to point out social media. Go, if they have social media channels, look and see what different employees at the company are actually wearing. I know on, you know, the virtual world that can look a little bit different. You know, a lot of people are dressed up from like the waist up and not the waist down. But, you know, social media can definitely be your friend there. So go check out what people are doing there. This next question is all about notes, and it came from a few people, so I'm going to combine it into one question because I think it makes the most sense. Can we take notes, or can we ask to take notes during the interview on what the interviewer is saying to us to remember later on? And with that, what do you think about candidates who bring notes with them to the interviews? You know, something to help jog their memory about power stories or other points they want to make sure to mention. You know, what are your thoughts on those two topics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for taking notes, it's challenging because you want to focus in the moment, right? And so if you're worried about jotting down everything that they asked, you might not be focusing on the things that are going to land with that interviewer, which is eye contact. So I would probably caution this. You know, it depends on how comfortable you are with maybe multitasking, and do you do a really good job of seeming very engaged as you take notes. So maybe practice, maybe that's one of the things you can kind of practice with a feedback partner is, do I seem engaged? Am I as inquisitive verbally as I should be? Because in my opinion, it would be hard to give a lot of the nonverbal cues, like the, yeah, you know, those kinds of like facial expressions and tones that may match if I'm really worried about capturing every detail. The other piece is I would, again, leverage the recruiter for this, right? Hey, I'm someone who loves to jot down notes. Is that something that would show up as odd during the interview, or is that something you think the interviewer would be okay with? And then if the recruiter is on board, I would still maybe ask the interviewer one more time, hey, I really want to make sure I understand a few things or can reference my notes later. Do you mind if I take a few notes? You know, I would never tell someone no, but I would, again, I'd be looking for, you know, some of those eye contact pieces. Through a Zoom or a virtual, I also might not be sure what you're doing. So I would preface, I'm going to take a few notes if you don't mind, because it may look like I'm on my phone, right? Or I'm doing something else and not really focused or engaged in the moment. So just think about how that might show up. As far as bringing notes, you know, I typically wouldn't bring notes to an in-person interview unless I was bringing like a portfolio, which had my resume, had my cover letter, had my references, and maybe had some notes. If I was bringing a binder type thing like that in with me, I'd probably review all of my things ahead of time, maybe while I'm in the lobby, and really be kind of focusing. I would avoid being on your phone. Again, you know, I would always go out to the lobby and ask my coordinator that day, like, hey, who stood out to you? And if somebody was on their phone the whole time, they weren't reading the posters on the wall, they weren't like, you know, paying attention. We would have a video looping that talked about company culture. If they weren't watching any of those things, that would kind of stand out as a little bit of a red flag there. So I would just be cognizant of how these things show up and reflect in the environment. It's not bad to bring notes, but just think about how would you read those during an interview? How would you reference those? And so maybe it's a better strategy just to prepare yourself ahead of time versus reviewing any of those during the interview itself.
Yeah, it goes back to your P of practice, practice, practice. You know, if you have practiced so much, you can't even forget it. You won't need notes. Another anonymous attendee here. And we get this question, I think, during almost every single webinar, but would love your thoughts on this topic. What's the best way to explain a gap on your resume? And this person's asking specifically due to illness, you know, your own or family member. But I mean, people take career gaps for a multitude of reasons. So how do you explain that during an interview?
Yeah, that's a great question because I get this a lot actually. And I wouldn't divulge any information that you're uncomfortable divulging, right? Particularly like your medical health information or that of a family member. It's illegal to be used against you, but I would also just understand that kind of legal ruling came out of somewhere, and it was out of employers holding that information against someone. So if it's information you don't need to bring up, I would not bring it up. Because, you know, their perception, again, in the back of their mind, even if it's unconscious bias, is thinking, oh, will this person be out again in the future, right? So I would try to avoid, you know, really going into any nitty gritty if it's something very personal or if it's something in regards to medical information. Now, I've had numerous things that really make a lot of sense. Again, kind of going through someone's thought process. If they've been caring for a loved one, maybe a parent was very ill, terminally ill, and they passed away, right? Like totally makes sense, understand myself why you would take that gap of time. However, is there something professional that you can tie in? So a lot of folks may volunteer while they're on some sort of sabbatical. I had an employee that we recently hired at our organization who had taken like a 9 to 12 month sabbatical, and he, you know, taught English when he was abroad and did some other things. You know, who knows how much of the time he was like teaching English or like coaching small businesses for development. But is there something you can put on your resume that might shield a kind of typical gap in employment where maybe you were contracting or maybe you were volunteering, you know, doing something, maybe you were a Fairygodboss expert, or, you know, is there something that you can put on your resume that may shield that time a little bit? And then again, if you are comfortable and it makes sense and it's not extremely personal in the sense of like a medical issue, it might make sense to bring it up. I will say from an employer perspective, one thing that I you know, try to evaluate when I see long gaps on a resume is, was it an untimely like separation and the person therefore, you know, we don't often see people quit jobs without another job lined up. So generally it speaks to something, right? Either they were laid off or, you know, unfortunately they were separated from the employer for some reason. In that case, right, I would not lie. I would never lie, because if somebody finds the information out, like you never know who knows who might ask an employer and get an off the cuff, you know, kind of answer. So just, you know, be truthful, but maybe be vague. If you were separated from your employment for some reason, I may not come out with that up front, but try to kind of shield that with some other kind of logical explanation. And if you were laid off, that's okay, right? Our company did a restructure. Unfortunately, I was one of the employees who was let go due to the fact that I was a field employee, not corporate, whatever, right? If there's some kind of logical explanation, I personally would share that information.
Perfect. This is a really interesting question. This person asks, what tips would you give to someone with a choppy work history? They have a strong academic background, they have a PhD, but they have very little work experience. So they're saying they have very few power stories to share. And I kind of want to tie in another question, you know, are power stories, can they only be related to work experiences, or are there other ways, you know, you can find those and develop those?
Yeah, Sam, that's a great question. And so I would say absolutely use power stories from any walk of life, right? If there's volunteer experience where you coordinated some sort of workforce to come together for like Habitats of Humanity, right? And, you know, 200 people came together for this week to build a house, right? That took a lot of effort. That took understanding schedules, it took planning, and right? So you can certainly use experiences that are outside of professional work. I typically see this with, you know, employees who are starting their career and maybe don't have a long history of work in general. They'll use a lot of like college projects. They use maybe volunteer experience. They may have experience from industries that aren't applicable or transferable, right? So if you're applying for a position in IT and you were a shift manager at Taco Bell, right, you still may have some really great examples about working under pressure or, you know, working effectively as a team. And so even if you don't have maybe that like multiple positive results, and you can't be as data driven as you'd like to, you can certainly still use things that aren't as transferable about, maybe the NPS score that you had at Taco Bell from your customer surveys, or, something about a team environment and the, team engagement score. Even if you weren't maybe the leader, you participated in a team and you were a peer mentor or a peer leader who helped rally troops together and improve company culture through X, Y, and Z, right? I think get creative about the power stories that you can tell. Everybody has things that they've accomplished, even, church or volunteer or things that are a little off the beaten path. And again, if you don't have those, start today, right? Become a volunteer somewhere today. Give back with Big Sisters, Big Brothers, right? Like you can use so many experiences that are out there that maybe don't take a ton of time, but are free for you to join, and help build a resume that shows you're a well-rounded candidate.
Perfect answer. Just a quick note that we have a lot of questions still left, and we're definitely not going to have time to get to all of them. So if yours does not get answered today, I'd recommend going to the Fairygodboss feed, posting your question there. We have millions of women weighing in, and they will definitely be able to offer some great advice as well. But with that being said, let's keep getting through some of these. This one is particularly interesting for kind of the pandemic world that we're living in right now. They're specifically asking, what are some good questions to ask when I'm interviewing at an early stage startup? I want to be able to determine the amount of risk I'd be taking on going into a startup, but I don't want to come across as negative or skeptical. And I think that's something a lot of people can relate to right now. You don't even have to be a startup. You could be going into just an industry that maybe you're not sure what their projected growth is. You're not even sure if they're going to be growing. How can you ask those questions, to secure yourself in the company without, again, coming off as negative or skeptical?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think it's maybe one that I would target more towards the recruiting team than the interviewer. But in just saying, hey, I'm really looking for somewhere that I can grow. I want to stay somewhere for the long term. I'm interested in aligning myself for at least 5 years, right? And I want to ensure that this is a good next move for me. Can you talk about the financial health of the organization? Have there been layoffs recently? Or, ask some questions there that may start to tease through some of the details. You can find a lot of information online, right? A lot of companies, publicly traded companies, have to submit earnings reports. So you can sift through that data. It's sometimes hard to read in like hundreds of pages, but you can maybe, get a good summary of some of those documents online. So I would certainly do your research, and, I would ask the honest questions, right? If somebody asks me a question around I really want to ensure this is a good long-term fit for me, I'm looking for somewhere I can continue to grow, my thought process isn't that it's negative. It's that, man, this person really wants a career. They're not looking for a job. They're looking somewhere to make home and, be able to have that conversation. So just think about how you frame it, practice it with a feedback partner. I wouldn't shy away from it because I think it's important. I would also try to get neutral resources. A company isn't going to probably advertise and openly tell you, yeah, we've just laid off 50% of our staff and now we're hiring back. So that's why we're interviewing you today. They're probably not going to be that brutally honest. So I would definitely do your own research to validate what you'll hear from the company itself.
Yeah, definitely do some research, some competitor analysis so that you have a good idea and a good framework when you even go into the conversation. All right, it looks like we have time for one more question. So I'm going to round out with this one. Despite all of us doing our best and practicing as much as possible, this happens to all of us. What's the best way to recover when you completely blank on an example to provide in response to a question?
Yeah, we all fumble, right? And, I fumbled at one point during the presentation as well. So I think it's important how you pick yourself up, how you dust yourself off. Don't let it throw you. I've seen candidates who have rebounded really nicely. They've made a joke about it, right? Like maybe said, yeah, I'm a little nervous, and kind of make light of it and move on and still have that confidence. And I've had other interview candidates who they've had one failure, one blip through an interview, and they've absolutely broken down. And, that is one sign. And I will note this with certain interviewers are going to have a different tactic of interviewing, and some is high pressure. They may ask you questions to stump you on purpose, They may want to see how you do under pressure. And so if you fall apart under pressure and you're going into an industry where it's really important, maybe it's a negotiation position or, high level management position, they want to see how you perform, how you rebound. So I'd say again, like breathing technique, take a deep breath, right? Allow yourself to get back into that you are confident. The only reason you are there today is because you earned that seat at the table, right? Your resume spoke to the fact that you deserved that interview. Get into a mental state where you are confident and just try to rebound and answer it again. Nobody's perfect. Everyone's made mistakes, right? So I think I have a sense of humor about it. Try to let it roll off you and, reframe, come back in, laugh it off. Maybe you say, hey, I totally flubbed that. Can I re-answer? I gave you an example I don't love, or I'm blanking at the moment. Can we circle back to this one and I'll answer it at the end? I would answer with something. If you circle back at the end and you're like, I still don't have an answer for this, I would try that tactic of being the politician and answering something similar. I wouldn't leave it blank. Some companies use a packet that's very formal where you get like a score for each question. So, better to have some points on the board for an answer than 0 points on the board if they are a company that uses a more formal scoring methodology. But yeah, I would answer something even if it doesn't perfectly fit based on your power stories. And just remember to practice and you'll have something up your sleeve.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. Again, this was a really great presentation, and thank you for answering all of these amazing questions that came in. Thank you to everybody who attended today's webinar. As a reminder, I'll be sending out the recording as well as Melissa's contact info by the end of the day today. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week. We'll catch you at the next one. Bye.
Thanks so much.